Hi guys, Matt from Haltech here, and today's video is going to be all about mapping the cold start corrections. But to understand any of this, we're first going to cover the theory of why we need these cold start maps. Then we'll jump into the software and check out how to manipulate them. The very first thing to know about calibrating any of the fuel correction tables is this is not the first thing you want to touch when it comes to the fuel tuning. Before you even think about dialing any fuel corrections in, you first want to ensure that you've correctly and accurately tuned the base fuel map. Now the reason for this is that any corrections we're about to talk about are corrections based on the numbers found in the base fuel map. So it's important that the base fuel map is tuned first. Then we move over into these corrections. Now, if you're not really sure how to tune your base fuel map to begin with, then I'd suggest watching some of our other recent videos, like the one that's tuning on VE or volumetric efficiency explained, timing versus air fuel ratio, or even our recent video on how self-tuning works. These are all really good videos to get you primed on how to tune your base fuel map and how to get it to the point where you might consider making these corrections to the fuel maps. Okay, so let's assume now that you've already got the fuel map fairly well dialed in once the engine is warm and at a full operating temperature. The next thing we're going to want to do is get the cold start maps dialed in. Now, this is important because we really want to be able to just get in the vehicle, hit the key, and the thing fires up regardless of temperature. The question is, what's the best process for doing this? And that's exactly what I'm going to walk through today. But before we get too deep into what maps to turn on and when, let's first get an understanding of what's happening in the engine that's driving this requirement for more fuel to be delivered where the engine's cold. Now there's a couple of underlying fundamental principles that we need to know that will help us when we're setting up and tuning the cold start correction maps. The very first thing to understand is that neither gasoline nor alcohol-based fuels will ignite as a liquid. Now we've got to first turn our liquid fuel into a gas before it becomes available for combustion. Now the simple way to do this is to evaporate or boil the fuel before we try and burn it, and considering the temperature inside our combustion chamber will be close to 1000 degrees when the engine's running, that's not all that big of a task. But of course, the engine has to get running first. Now following on from this, gasoline-based fuels are quite a complex mixture of organic compounds, and as a result, gasoline does not all evaporate or boil at a single temperature, unlike, say, water that boils at 100 degrees Celsius or 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Petrol, or gasoline, has some components that vaporizes at as little as 40 degrees Celsius or 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and other components that don't vaporize off until over 120 or 250 degrees Fahrenheit. We call this curve of fuel evaporation the fuel distillation curve, and you can look it up online for nearly all common fuel types. Alcohol fuels are actually chemically a lot more pure than petroleum-based fuels, and therefore they've got a much more stable distillation temperature, which means they're much more like water in that you get no state change from liquid to gas until a certain temperature is reached, and then once you're above the boiling point, all the liquid vaporizes and it turns to gas. Now, interestingly, ethanol's distillation temperature is close to 80 degrees Celsius, which is one of the reasons that cars running on E85 can be really hard to start in the morning, especially in winter. But more on this one later. For now, we still need to know the answer to the question of why we need more fuel to be delivered to the engine when it's cold. The first reason is that on the very first combustion cycle, the entire engine's temperature is below any fuel's distillation temperature. Now, what this means is that no matter how correct the mixture of air and fuel that we've put into the incoming airstream, if we can't heat up the fuel enough to evaporate it, we can't set it on fire. Now, fortunately, we've got two things that are working in our favour here. The first thing is compression, and compression creates heat. Not a massive amount, but it's enough to help. The second thing is the spark. Now, this is actually really hot and capable of evaporating some fuel nearby the spark itself and setting it on fire. But it's only in the combustion chamber for a very small amount of time, and it relies on there being a fuel droplet close enough by that it can actually heat the fuel, evaporate it, and then set it on fire. Once the fire is started, the heat released on the combustion itself is enough to evaporate further fuel in the cylinder, and the fire continues to spread. And on the next intake stroke, there's some residual heat in the combustion chamber, so it's a little bit easier to start the fire, and once we've had 3 or 4 combustion events in the hull, we can pretty reliably ensure that given the right amount of air and fuel, we're going to get fire. Now, I'm going to pause here for a moment, then we're going to go back, and then we'll go forward again, but I wanted to pause and just point out one thing, and it's actually not fuel related, it's ignition timing related. Oftentimes, when we're struggling to get a vehicle to fire up and run when it's cold, you can find good success in bringing the ignition timing advance all the way back to around 0 degrees or top dead center. The reason this helps is twofold. Firstly, it's the point of maximum compression, and compression equals heat. The more you pressurize air, the hotter it gets, right? That's why we have intercoolers on turbo cars. The second reason is the closer we get to top dead center, the closer together we're pushing each of the individual air and fuel molecules, which increases our likelihood of having some of the fuel close enough to the spark plug when the spark event happens to heat it, catch it on fire, and start the combustion process off. Now, let's go back for a moment and talk about the other reason we might need more fuel to be delivered into the engine when it's cold for it to run. It's actually the same reason, which is liquid fuel doesn't burn, but in this case, it's a slightly different twist on the matter. So let's assume that our fuel injector did a really incredible job of atomizing the fuel as it's passed through the injector nozzle and turned the fuel into a gas. Now that's not realistic and not how it works, but let's assume for the sake of the argument that it did work this way. As soon as that fuel hits a cold intake manifold or a cold intake valve or combustion chamber sleeve or piston or whatever, it immediately turns back into a liquid on that surface, and it's no longer available for combustion again because that surface is cold or lower than the distillation temperature. This is important to note because if your fuel injectors are located a long way from the intake valve, you might have to supply a boatload more fuel on cold startup than on an engine where the injectors are located really close to the intake. The reason for this is simply distance. The longer the passage of fuel that needs to travel along, the less likely it is to stay suspended in air and not come into contact with one of those cold surfaces that's going to turn the fuel back into a liquid. Now, as a side note, this is one of the primary driving forces behind direct injection engines. It's nothing to do with output power. We already know from our previous videos that air is the limiting factor when making horsepower and not fuel. But rather, by injecting fuel directly into the combustion chamber on the compression stroke, there's very little wasted fuel, which is really good for economy figures, but more importantly, it's good for tailpipe emissions. There's next to no wasted fuel, so the engine can be running at the stoichiometric air-fuel ratio within seconds and not minutes. In a port injection engine, when the engine's cold, we have to inject additional fuel into the intake manifold because not all of the fuel injected becomes available for combustion. That's not entirely true actually. Most of the additional fuel that we add does become available for combustion as the engine warms up and it begins to evaporate off. Now the tricky part is determining how much of the additional fuel that was being added that wet the walls down of the intake is being evaporated and at what rate. Now there's quite a few theories out there on how to model this behaviour, but none of them are all that practical. So, what do we do in the real world? Well, we take on board the science of why we need this additional fuel in the first place when the engine's cold, and we apply a logical process to tuning these maps in the ECU software. And so for that, we're going to take a look into the Haltech NSP software and walk through the sequence that I would use when setting up the cold start correction. Now the first thing that I want to point out here is this is not a set of hard and fast rules. These are the steps that I take and the order that I use that makes sense to me. You might have a different system and that's totally fine, but can I suggest if your system has the coolant temperature correction map as your very first port of call rather than the absolute last thing you touch, then maybe you could take some notes and give this system a try. Then let me know how it goes for you in the comments section below. Now before you attempt to do any tuning on your cold start maps, you do need to make sure that your engine has gone full Bernie and is genuinely cold. I suggest first thing in the morning. You'll probably need a couple of consecutive mornings to really dial in these maps. Now ensure all of your fuel correction maps are turned off. You'll notice in the NSP software, even with all the fuel correction maps turned off, you still have the prime pulse and the cranking correction map available. That's for good reason. You always want these ones on. So what do? These two maps work together to get the engine to fire up on the very initial hit of the key. The prime pulse fires all of the injectors for a set amount of time as soon as the ECU sees the first crank signal. That's one pump of the throttle that we used to do on a carby to get the thing to kick. Now, it's important to note that the units in this map is an absolute number in milliseconds. And it's important to know that because if you have 100cc injectors, then this map needs to have numbers that are 10 times larger than if you had, say, 1000cc injectors for the same volume of fuel to be delivered. So this map here is a little bit sensitive to the size of injector that you're using. Now the cranking correction map, on the other hand, this map has values that are a percentage correction. So regardless of your injector flow rate, 100% in this map will double the calculated injector opening time. Now, double sounds like a lot, but when you're cranking the engine over, remember, the main aim is just to supply enough fuel to get fire in the hole. So the first step in the setup of your cold start maps is, with the engine dead cold, adjust the prime pulse and the cranking correction maps so that the engine fires once, as in brum, pff. So brum, pff. That's all it needs to run for, nothing more than that. Once you can achieve this on the key, you can move on. Now we can turn on one of the other correction maps, and I always start with the post-start correction map. Now notice this map is a 3D map with engine temperature on one axis and engine runtime on the other. Now this is actually the map that is most commonly overlooked, but personally, I think on a modern engine, this is the map that really should be doing most of, if not all, of the cold running corrections. So the first thing to note is that you can actually extend this map out well beyond the 20 seconds in the base map here. And that's exactly what I'd suggest you do. Extend this out to somewhere around the 3 to 4 minute range. And really, after 3 minutes of engine runtime, the coolant and oil, it might not be up at full operating temperature yet, but the intake valve and the combustion chamber are certainly hot enough to be evaporating off all of the fuel that's being delivered into the intake manifold. So it's probably a better measure of how much fuel to deliver anyway. Now this rings true for nearly all modern engines where the injector is placed down near the intake valve. If you're running a throttle body injection setup, you may need to extend the post-start map out beyond the 3 minute mark for best results. Using the post-start correction map, you want to add as much fuel as required to maintain at least your target air-fuel ratio while the engine is in the post-start phase. One quick tip here is to ensure that the very last cell in the post-start map is 0. Otherwise, the correction that is being commanded in the last cell will get carried on forever. And it's only now, and only if you really need to, that you might turn on the coolant temperature correction map. In fact, it's quite common to see the coolant temp correction map not used at all. Or some people like to use it as an engine protection feature for when the engine temperature is getting too high. But even then, I think there's a better way, because if you're relying on the coolant temperature correction map for a degree of engine protection, but you also have closed loop O2 control turned on, the O2 control is actually going to learn out your fuel correction in this map. And it's for this purpose that the target lambda correction maps were created. Now this way, even with O2 control turned on, the ECU will target richer or leaner air-fuel ratios based on what you've programmed into the target lambda correction maps. Now, I'm not going to lie, I'm a really huge fan of using the Haltech ECU's inbuilt closed-loop O2 control to continually tidy up the fuel map as I'm driving around in real-world conditions. And a lot of people think that there's no way of doing this while the engine's cold, but that's not entirely true. You most certainly can get creative with both of the coolant temp correction target lambda map and the generic target lambda correction maps to work in your favour here. Alright, so let's have a quick recap before we keep moving on. We need to supply additional fuel to the engine when it's cold because not all of the fuel that goes in the intake manifold gets evaporated and therefore it's not all available for combustion. Some of the fuel that we inject doesn't even make it to the combustion chamber because it gets caught up on the intake manifold walls. The further the injector is away from the valve, the more additional fuel will be required when the engine's cold. When we're tuning the cold start maps, first, start with the prime pulse and the cranking correction maps. Once the engine will start and die, turn on the post start map. Extend it out to 3 minutes and have this map do the lion's share of your cold start corrections. So, let's talk for a moment about alcohol fuels like ethanol and methanol. Like I said before, alcohol fuels are much more pure in their chemical makeup, so they have less variance in when they start boiling off than petroleum-based fuels. Long story short is that ethanol remains a liquid up until about 80 degrees Celsius. Above that, it'll boil or evaporate, and we can use it for combustion. So what does this mean for tuning the cold start for E85? Well, a few things. The first is a higher percentage of the fuel will stay liquid in the intake manifold for longer as the engine warms up. The second thing is we need to add a lot of additional fuel to the intake on cranking just to get the engine started. It's not uncommon to see numbers in the prime pulse in the 500 to 1000 milliseconds range on E85, sometimes even higher with smaller flow rate injectors. Remember, we're only talking about the prime pulse here. That's one single squirt of the injectors when the engine first starts cranking, so it's okay to have a really big number there. Now the other lever we have to pull with E85 is ignition timing. We almost always find that we need the firing of the spark to be in the 0 to 5 degree before top dead center mark for reliable cold starts on E85. Firing the spark closer to TDC increases the cylinder pressure, which increases the temperature of the compressed air in the combustion chamber and also squeezes the air and fuel molecules in the chamber closer together, which increases the likelihood of some fuel being close enough to the spark at the time of firing to actually start the fire. Some other food for thought on this topic. Because I know these questions are probably going to get asked in the comments below anyway, I'll attempt to address them now before they even become a comment war. The first thing worth discussing is, what about when the engine's warm? What do I do then? Well, the process is similar but different. Now, because the engine is already warm, it doesn't suffer from the same fundamental limitation that the fuel that is being delivered to the intake manifold stays as a liquid and therefore is not available for combustion. So the first thing is, warm startups require way less additional fuel in the prime pulse and the cranking fuel correction maps. This holds true for both petroleum-based fuels and alcohol-based fuels. And we tend to find that the amount of additional enrichment in the prime and cranking maps on hot start are pretty similar on E85 and gasoline or petrol. Now, in the transition temperatures between full cold and full operating temperature, we can wean out the additional fuel correction much quicker on petroleum fuels because they start evaporating at a lower temperature than E85. Now, then there's the issue of injection timing. Not how much this fuel is being delivered, but when the fuel is being delivered. Now, this one can be a double-edged sword, and I'm going to explain the theory here, and I'll leave it up to you as to what you do with this information. When the engine is up to temperature and the injector sprays fuel onto the back of a closed valve, like in a modern engine, the valve is hot, the fuel gets very hot and is effectively atomized, and it's therefore available for combustion. However, when the engine's cold, the intake valve is cold, so you may want to spray that fuel timed with the intake valve being open to minimize the wetting of the intake manifold. Now, of course, depending on the size of the camshaft, you'd also want to avoid spraying the fuel into the overlap vent and losing that fuel straight out the exhaust before the party even gets started. Now, of course, this becomes less of a problem the further the injector is away from the valve. Well, that's not entirely true. It doesn't become less of a problem, it's just less important. It's that you've got bigger issues to contend with because you're losing so much fuel to the wetting of the intake walls of the manifold. When you spray the fuel is far less important than the pure volume of additional fuel that you're going to need to supply. Now you add to this that when an injector is located a long distance from the intake valve, it's normally not a sequential injection system. So the fuel's not being sprayed into the manifold at any particular time relative to a specific valve opening anyways. Now all of this is just to say injection timing can and does play a big part in smooth starting and running engines. However, my experience has been that injection timing doesn't make a lick of difference until it's in just the wrong spot, and then it's terrible. So injection timing in a port injection system is more about keeping the injection event away from the wrong time than it is about finding exactly what the right time is to inject the fuel. Clear as mud, right? We've covered a lot in this video today, and I'm sure that I have missed something. So if you have further questions, please put them in the comments below and I'll try and address them there. As usual, ring the bell icon to get updates on all of our latest videos, subscribe to our social media channels on Facebook and Instagram, stop by our website, pick up some product or sweet merch. In fact, first 3 people to correctly answer what temperature does E85 boil off at will get one of these free laptop sleeves. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter for all the latest up-to-date product information, software updates, and pricing information. Well, I'm Matt from Haltech, and I'll see you next time.